Oh, great. Senator, we go live. And there you are. Excellent. Senator Joe Lieberman, I want to thank everyone for joining. I know that there's a little bit of an echo. This is part of technology in the age of COVID-19. If we can figure out a way for candle oil to survive for 8 days, even though we were projecting it to only work for one, we can work our way through this.
There you go.
I am so grateful for you to be here. People on this call probably don't realize that you and I have known each other for 25 years, and you've been so kind to me for that amount of time. Senator, I'm going to begin with something very special, and I'm going to read it, which I never do, but I want to get it right.
Okay.
I begin with a story from Eli Beer. He's a dear friend of mine. Senator, you may know him. He's the founder of United Hatzalah in Israel. And they use a technology similar to Uber, in which it locates the nearest volunteer to an emergency. Normally it's used for life and death, but now it's being used for humanitarian aid, to get food and medicines to the elderly. 5 minutes before Passover holiday, this is about 2 weeks ago, their dispatch got a call from an old lady, a Holocaust survivor, who was crying, saying that she'd lit the candles for every holiday. She never missed them. But because of the quarantine, she couldn't get out to get those candles. So their dispatch connected them with a gentleman, a volunteer named Khalid. He's a United Hatzalah participant who was living in Jaffa. So Khalid jumped into his ambicycle, went to the nearest supermarket. He bought her those candles, and he bought her a bouquet of flowers for the holiday. He drove over to her home, knocked on her door, gave her the candles and flowers, and said Chag Sameach, which is happy Passover, happy holiday in Hebrew. This Arab volunteer is one of 6,000 people who are willing to stop everything they are doing and to help out. Senator, I wanted you as part of this, and I had to practice that story because it made me cry every time I told it. It's a beautiful story.
It is.
Do we have other opportunities like this, other stories like this, other things to give us hope now in this challenging environment that we face?
Yeah, you mean particularly between the Israelis and Arabs or Israelis and Palestinians? I'll start with that, Frank. First of all, it's great to be with you. We've known each other a long time. I have great admiration and even affection for you. And I hope we can continue this friendship for a long, long time with God's help. So Eli Beer is a wonderful person, started this kind of nonprofit kind of first responder service, which exists in Israel. And they do a remarkable job. I mean, one of my kids moved there with her husband and 5 little boys. And, sometimes when we're walking to synagogue with my son-in-law and the grandchildren, we'll see somebody as we approach a little late running into the synagogue from a kind of an ambulance. And I said, oh my God, I hope nobody's hurt. I wonder what's going on. Well, it turns out that it was just a guy who is very religious, but he had just driven back from a call on the Sabbath and he was running in to pray. Not that anybody was sick inside. So, I'll tell you something, and we don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but one of the great, and this relates really to COVID in a way, if you go into any hospital in Israel, it is remarkably diverse, both in the healthcare provider, doctor, nurse population, and in the patient population. By that, I mean to say not only the range of Israelis, but Israeli Arabs and Palestinians. And I can tell you personally, one of my other kids was over there studying for 3 or 4 years. And during that time, they had 2 children, 2 babies, born in the hospital in Afula, and both times, the baby, just by the rotation, was delivered by an Israeli Arab obstetrician. Go into the hospital, wow, secular Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, Arabs, some Muslims, some wearing full covering, others not. I mean, it's so. What does this say? And hopefully, we're learning this in response to COVID-19. When disease strikes, unfortunately, it reminds us that we're in this together, and hopefully, we can come out of this with that wisdom and insight, and not only related to health crises, but all the opportunities that we have, that we will maximize if we're working together.
So let's talk
Okay.
about Washington, D.C.
Good.
You are the chair, the leader of No Labels. And I got to ask you, you've got the Senate voting now to confirm judges. You have the Speaker of the House, who is back writing her own legislation on COVID-19. It doesn't seem like the House and Senate are working together. It doesn't seem like the Democrats and the Republicans are working together. Even with COVID-19, what are the prospects of genuine cooperation in Washington?
Yeah. So this is, this is a moment, and I'm actually going to start with some good news, but I'm not sure how long it's going to last. I mean, we're obviously going through an unprecedented health crisis, and it's created an unprecedented economic crisis in our country. And it all comes at a time of unprecedented partisanship, worst, I think, in our history. And yet, notwithstanding what I would call a kind of background partisan static, the truth is that so far, both the president, the administration, both houses of Congress, Speaker Pelosi, Senator McConnell, Senator Schumer, et cetera, have actually reached strong bipartisan agreements on these, I use the word again, unprecedented pieces of legislation, getting trillions of dollars into our economy, hopefully into people's pockets, and trying to keep us afloat economically until we can figure out how to beat back the virus. So for all of us who wondered, was there any limit to the partisanship? Thank God we found, unfortunately, in a crisis, almost a catastrophe when you think about the number of people who have died. Yeah, people will come together. Now, why did I say it may not last? Yeah, I think it's going to get harder as we go on to the opportunities for the next bills. But honestly, both sides, both parties, White House and Congress, want to make this better. And I don't think any of them want to be blamed for not. And so I still have a little optimism, but most of all, I have appreciation for what they've been able to do so far. It's part of why the results of this crisis, these two crises, health and economic, are not worse than they could have been, and why, notwithstanding a bad day on the markets today, why it's one of the reasons why I think the markets have stayed up much more than we would have guessed based on a lot of the economic data. So we've got a lot of work to do.
I've always known you as a straight shooter, even to your own detriment.
Yes.
On both sides, who's a greater threat to bipartisanship, AOC or Mitch McConnell?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a great Frank Luntz question. I would say AOC, really, because, I mean, Mitch is a partisan, but he's a real master of the legislative process. And I'm not defending everything he's done in the name of partisanship, but AOC is very ideological, much more ideological than Mitch. And ultimately, Mitch comes to a point where not every time, but a lot of times, he wants to be part of a solution to a problem. And he's the majority leader, so he can make that happen. So far, AOC has not shown that same ability. I mean, she got elected as an anti. She's very ideological. She's critical of her own leadership and the majority, even in the House Democratic Caucus, which is a relatively liberal Democratic caucus. So I guess I would say that AOC is a bigger threat. in terms of partisanship.
Are you nervous or uncomfortable because you're a lifelong Democrat? And I've always said about these calls, I do not mean to put the speaker on the spot. I want to provide some insight, and particularly you, because you've been great to me. But is it hard for you to be critical when that person wears the same label that you do?
Not really. I mean, I did it when I felt it was justified when I was in office, and thinking inevitably, I'm no more perfect than anybody else. You're thinking about the next election, uh, but you reach a point on an issue where you just say, I got to do what I think is right for the country and hope that the people in Connecticut will appreciate it, even if I make some other people unhappy. But today, I feel that the party that I joined when John F. Kennedy was president, he was my inspiration, as he was so many in my generation. Probably wouldn't nominate John F. Kennedy if he was running for president today. That's how much it's changed. I must say that there is some hope in the fact that Joe Biden is clearly going to be the nominee of the Democratic Party, because in the spectrum of people running this time for president who had a chance, there were there were certainly some others like Bernie Sanders who were way to the left, and I think would have changed the Democratic Party, and I believe brought it down. Anyway, so maybe there's some hope there. Now, part of that is that I think a lot of Democrats want to support somebody they think can defeat President Trump. Obviously, that's a negative motivation. But I would say Joe Biden is a center-left Democrat. He's not a left-left Democrat. And usually the party has won when it's been closer to the center.
Your Senate colleague in Connecticut, Chris Dodd, is one of the four people on the vice presidential search committee.
Yeah.
Do you have any preference, knowing that you want Joe Biden elected, do you have any preference over who his VP should be?
I don't. I mean, honestly, you got to give him a lot of latitude to choose who he wants. I mean, if I could speak in general terms, I think maybe this seems obvious, but ultimately, Vice President Biden's got to choose somebody to run with him who the American people can look at and say, this person could be president if that was required. And particularly now with this COVID-19, economic problems, et cetera, et cetera. I'll tell you a story, which is no secret. And of course, I wasn't there, but I gather the night that Vice President Gore, I heard this, of course, from somebody in the room, made the selection of who his running mate was going to be. The discussion seemed in 2000, the discussion seemed to be moving not to me. And let's see, how can I do this appropriately? Warren Christopher, great former Secretary of State, distinguished partner in law firm in California, Melvin and Myers. He was the head of the vetting process for Al Gore. And he said, I just want to say to you, because they were looking at somebody who had been in the Senate, been active much fewer years than I had. He said, Mr. Vice President, this choice will say more about you than about the person you choose. And you really have to feel comfortable that the person you choose, you can make the case that they are, in the event of a crisis, they're prepared to hold the highest office in the land. And that apparently turned the discussion. So maybe I make that point because I benefited from it, Frank, but really, particularly at this time, unprecedented, there's the word again, unease in our society. Joe Biden's got great experience. He's been through a lot. He's capable of being a leader that we need, but he's got to have a second person there who the public, not just the core Democrats, can feel the same way about.
We've had this happen before. And you've been considered another time.
Yeah.
And that was John McCain in 2008. And how history may have been different if he'd gone with that choice and did not face opposition among Republicans. But that's got to be tough for you. The idea that you be running with a Republican, and I go back at this because I'm so impressed with No Labels and what the organization has been able to do, and how you've got House members actually working together and sometimes saying no to their own leaders. But what is it like to know that you could end up standing in front of a convention of people who had worked against you for your entire career? I'm curious what goes through your head
Yeah. That's
because it could have happened.
could have happened. That's actually a great question. Um, when John McCain's campaign manager, Rick Davis, called me and said, John wants to bet you for vice president. Are you willing? So I said, oh, you're kidding me. I really, I said, how could he do that? He said, I said to him, we're the best of friends and we agree on a lot. We disagree on a lot, but that never affected our working together. And I said, I got elected to the Senate in the last race as an independent, but I'm a registered Democrat. How are you going to explain that? Well, that's exactly what John has in mind. So, and then they pursued it. I must say, I always thought that it was not going to happen, but if it did happen, it would have been. I would have put my heart totally into it. And while I'm sure there would have been some people at the convention, which I guess that year was in Minneapolis, who had worked against me, I was blessed to have a lot of friends in the Republican Party over the years. And, when I first got elected to the Senate in 1988, I had an unusual amount of Republican support. Part of it because I ran against an idiosyncratic, shall I say, Republican Senator Lowell Weicker. So I had endorsements from the one that got the most attention was the late, great conservative columnist, William F. Buckley Jr., who I had known for years, lived in Connecticut and really admired and liked very much. And Dick Pizzuto, who had been a candidate for the Republican nomination for governor in the preceding election, just didn't like Weicker. And we had worked together in the state Senate. So I always felt that that I was elected not just by Democrats, even though I was a Democratic candidate, that I was elected by a mix of Democrats, Republicans, and independents, and I had an obligation to try to be of service to all of them. So and all the times I've been asked about that McCain experience, Frank, nobody's ever asked me that question, but if it had happened, I would have been comfortable with it and really worked for John. It was a hard year, and John knew it. To beat Barack Obama, who at that point seemed like he was walking on the mountaintops, and Lehman Brothers collapsed, the economy was in trouble. President Bush was not at the height of his popularity, so it was hard to be the Republican candidate. I have a friend who's a bit of a cynic, Frank, who says to me, you're lucky that McCain wasn't able to nominate you because you could have gone down in history as the only person in America who ever got nominated for vice president twice on different party tickets and lost both times. And he said,
Oh, I knew that was coming. You would have been the first president since Abraham Lincoln in 1864 to pick someone from another party if McCain had done that. And by the way, I want you to know that two of your voters, when you ran for the Senate in Connecticut, were my mother and my father. And it was the only time that they ever did vote Republican. And I've never acknowledged that publicly, but they loved you.
That means a
I
lot.
got one more political question, and then we're going to go globally because of your experience in the Homeland Security Committee. If this is a tough question, but I want to challenge you if you can try, because he was a good friend of yours. If John McCain, knowing all that has happened, were alive today, and he were choosing between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, who would John McCain choose?
Oh, I don't feel I'm authorized to say, but you know what? Keep your eye on the McCain family. I mean, they'll tell you what John would do. And I think I saw somewhere that Megan already said that she'd be voting for Joe Biden. Joe and John were very close. And as you may have noticed, John and President Trump have not been very close. But John was he was a maverick, but he was a very loyal Republican also. So it wouldn't have been easy for him to, if he were here, to support a Democratic candidate.
Okay, let's do global now.
Okay.
And the big issue is China. It's going to
Yes.
be, other than COVID-19, it's going to be the most significant dividing issue between Biden and Trump. They're both trying to get the advantage right now. They're both discussing policy right now. You ran the Homeland Security Committee, and you ran it in a bipartisan fashion. But I'm now asking you, as someone who doesn't know the answer, what do we need to do going forward on China so that we're not in the same situation again, economically, politically, national security, healthcare? What should our policy be?
Yeah, well, this will be the big challenge of the next period of our foreign relations, international diplomacy. I mean, to me, the larger immediate threat, because they're so extreme, is the Iranian government, and they're also kind of desperate now economically. But China's a great power. It's an enormous country which has made tremendous leaps forward in terms of their economic growth, their innovation, et cetera. The problem is that they give us here too many reasons to mistrust them, and that the danger is that we will slide into a Cold War or worse with China. It takes two to make this better. So it takes the Chinese government and the U.S. government, but it's so clearly in the interests of both countries to have a mutually beneficial relationship. So it's obvious it's like the most immediate from the coronavirus pandemic that we and a lot of other countries have made ourselves dependent on the Chinese for supply chain, for not only supplies like masks and gloves, but um, pharmaceutical research, for instance, supplies of pharmaceuticals, prescription drugs that we need. My guess is we're going to try to develop more of that ourselves so we can be self-reliant. But the Chinese also buy a lot of stuff here from our companies, and there is a mutual benefit to the relationship now. But really, it takes the two leaders at some point, and I wish it could happen among members of Congress and members of the government in Beijing as well, to really try to sit down and develop ideas for building trust, because this relationship is going to determine not only our security, but our prosperity for the years ahead. And it's so clearly, to repeat, in the interest of both of us to figure out how we can trust. They can help us trust them more, and we can also do the same for them if they really mistrust us. But otherwise, it's going to be tough going, and it'll affect our children and our children's children in ways that will not be good.
Fox News is already saying that we should not trust the Chinese government, not the people, but the government.
Right.
And Donald Trump has said the same thing, trying to get an advantage over Joe Biden. If you were that leader, if you were still head of Homeland Security, would you trust the Chinese government?
Well, I would try to trust them. In other words, I would say to them, hey, you've done this, and we're worried about it. For instance, they've got some laws on their books that certainly seem to say that that businesses in China have to comply with the requests or demands of the government. if the government feels that it's necessary for the national well-being. Now, that, of course, and that then worries people here that if we get into a crisis, including a potential military conflict, that Chinese companies that we rely on in a host of areas, supply chain, pharmaceuticals, telecommunications, could begin to compromise our security and our prosperity to weaken us. So we've got to ask them to take steps without them feeling that they're somehow losing face, because they benefit so much from the good relationship with us. And we should listen to them as well if there's something we're doing that they're worried about that makes them distrust us, that we can do something to fix. This is not going to be easy because they're a rising power. We are a great power. The government there is strong. I mean, it's fascinating. It's become a kind of market-based capitalist economy in China, and yet the influence of the government in owning companies or affecting the market is significant, way beyond anything here. But the worst development is that the government has really clamped down on political dissent, and that makes it hard for us to trust them. So I guess I would try to break through, and I hope President Trump, President Xi have the chance to sit down and talk about how they can de-escalate here. But don't expect it to happen, unfortunately, during this year, because I think what we're going to have in the campaign, it seems that China is going to be a target, and that Vice President Biden, President Trump are going to be competing with each other, as you suggest, Frank, to see who can be more anti-China. And I suppose we could hope that in China, they take it with a grain of salt because we're in the middle of a campaign, but they may not. And they're also at a fragile time with the outbreak of the virus in Wuhan. They're taking aggressive steps in the South China Sea, which just increase our distrust of them. Part of it may be that they're doing that to distract their own public from the troubles they're having now, both in terms of their health and economically. But we can't be sure of that. So when they make the moves they are in the South China Sea, that worries us. And it's a real challenge to statecraft. And
So
I hope we're up to it.
I'm being yelled at
Okay.
for not following up with you about your comment that Iran was a greater threat than China. Why do you say that now when Iran is going through one hell of an experience with COVID-19? And yes, they are launching potentially hostile missiles and satellites in the air. But why do you pick Iran as the number one threat to America?
Okay, fair question, because they are an extreme ideology. I mean, to compare them to China, China has all that we've just talked about, but really it's also all about prosperity and holding the country together. And they haven't traditionally been an aggressive sort of power that wants to dominate the rest of the region. And they have to continue to assure us that Iran just is a fanatical Islamic extremist power. It has a brutal record with its own people. It's supported. It's the greatest state sponsor of terrorism in the world, according to our State Department. It's been responsible for the deaths of hundreds and hundreds of Americans, both soldiers of ours in Iraq that were killed by Iraqi Shia trained by Iran, but also in specific terrorist attacks throughout the region. And right now, the Iranians are in a controlling position in Syria, Lebanon, influential, unfortunately, in Iraq and in Yemen. And they really want to break out and to become a nuclear power and threaten us as well. And unlike the Chinese, who I think are more balanced and less likely to push the button, God forbid, if you just listen to what the Iranian leadership says, it's constantly about death to America. Obviously, death to Israel too, but death to America. And I think we've been through this before too many times. And when people say things that seem so extreme, we tend not to want to believe them. But I believe these people. So that's why I say in the short run, they're a more serious threat to American security and world security than the Chinese are.
Before I leave the Middle East, is there hope for peace between the Palestinians and Israelis? Can we find coexistence and common ground, particularly with the challenges, the personal challenges? Obviously, COVID-19 knows no borders, and they've been cooperating
They have,
quietly
right.
in a more constructive way. Can we get peace between them?
Unfortunately, there's a lot of interaction between Israelis and Palestinians that's peaceful and constructive. But at the level of the government, the governments, there's not been a willingness, a meeting of the minds. It's a tragedy. Both publics clearly would benefit from peace. I can tell you. I mean, I know I've spent a lot of time on both sides of the border, and but I can tell you certainly about the Israelis that if there was a good, solid two-state solution that made them feel secure, if you put that to a referendum in Israel, I bet 80% of the Israeli Jews would vote for it. And I bet a majority, I can't say 80%, but a majority of the Palestinians would too. But right now, the leadership just is the Palestinian Authority, particularly, and of course, half the Palestinian territory is controlled by Hamas, which still calls for the destruction of Israel. Twice in the last 20 years, once at Camp David with President Clinton, Ehud Barak, and Arafat, and then during 5 to 6 years later with Prime Minister Olmert and Abu Mazen. Really, they came pretty close to a two-state agreement, but both times the Palestinians walked away. And I think there's an anxiety about taking the risks that are necessary for peace. So I hate to say it, I can't see a real formal peace agreement in the near future. But I do see a sort of stability between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And honestly, the Israeli economy is pretty good. It's the Palestinians that would really benefit from peace. Of course, the big factor that has changed in recent years in the Middle East is between Israel and the Arab countries. And that, in part, is because the Arab countries, led by the Saudis, Emiratis, Egypt, but are modernizing, and they're much more threatened by Iran than they are by Israel. So is Israel. So there's been a kind of coming together there. Now, don't expect there's a lot of interchange at the private level between Israel and the Arab countries, Sunni Arab countries. I don't expect it to go public very soon. And the one thing that could break the logjam there would be some kind of agreement, step forward, if not a final agreement, between Israel and the Palestinians. But right now, it's hard to see that happening. Unfortunately, it's a tragedy.
So the doctor who took care of me in New Hampshire just asked me a question.
Yeah.
Which is it? Does the White House peace plan have any likelihood of even moving the peace process forward, or is that just dead on arrival?
Well, it has merit on paper, really, but it's not. It hasn't created the context in which both parties are ready to come to the table, and the Palestinians particularly have rejected it outright. So even though my impression is I wasn't there, that the representatives of the Trump administration spent a lot of time working with the Palestinians on the plan. It's unfortunate, and it's different from those two occasions where we came closest: Clinton, Barak, Arafat, Olmert, Abu Mazen. when there was direct negotiations. Unfortunately, it's hard to see much happening with the Trump Middle East peace plan, although I think on paper it has a lot to recommend it, because the Palestinians won't even think about it, won't even come to the table to talk about it. And that's a lost opportunity.
I've got this call is about 1/3 Democrat and a very strong Biden supporter. And I know this is going to agitate the Trump people. Are you concerned with Russia trying to manipulate our elections? Are you concerned about their interference, about the integrity of our ballot system? You are the leader of no labels. So this does not have to be a Republican or Democratic
Yeah.
response. A lot of people are afraid that the integrity is in jeopardy.
Yeah, so of course, I am too, and I mean that's just what that's what all the investigations and facts I've seen about Russian involvement in 2016 tells us. And of course, the Russians have been doing this for years, not just here, but even more in Europe and most of all in European countries that are close to Russia itself. So you have to assume that's going to happen. I mean, to me, simplistically, there are a couple of levels of this. One is the extent to which Russians or others, the Chinese, may try to infiltrate in our elections. Even the Iranians have there's some indication that they may. One is to just disseminate false information on social media, which are intended to divide the country or perhaps favor one candidate or another. And, you just have to, that's up to us. We have to be smart enough to try to work our way through that and see what's real and what's not. The other, which is much more insidious to me, is whether any foreign country has the ability to tamper with our voting machines from far off, insofar as they are digital and related to the internet, and that we have to really work hard to try to create blocks for that happening. I mean, it's a very odd thing to say, Frank, but sometimes it feels like the best thing we could do for the integrity of American elections is to go back to the paper ballot. Feels like a return to yesteryear, but even that could be tampered with. But at least you got a paper ballot, and you have to count them. And it's the local. I mean, the local officials can, if they're corrupt, can tamper with those. I can tell you stories about some of my experiences in New Haven, Connecticut, but we'll do that offline. Even though the statute of limitations has expired, anyway. Yes, I am worried about foreign intervention in our election. And it's the most outrageous thing that could happen, because this is what we're about. I mean, we're a republic. We elect our government. It's just those who govern are controlled by those who they govern. And if there's cheating and distortion in the election process, that basic promise of our republic is broken, and that's the worst.
So I'm going to go to the core of this as a way to bring this to a close. You've got two wonderful quotes, and I do this for everyone that I interview. And I'm going to read it because I don't want to get it wrong. There have been many times in our history when the proximity of an election has induced exactly the kind of leadership and consensus building that produce progress in our democracy. I think this election is going to be the worst. I mean, the ads are going to be horrible. I think the candidates are going to treat each other horrible. And what I cannot believe is that we're in the middle of all this crap,
right,
in Western Europe, in Asia, in North and South America. We got some really bad things that are going to happen in South America and Africa who've not been affected but will be.
right.
And we've got all this garbage going on. With all due respect, it seems like everyone's participating. Please tell me I'm wrong. Please tell me I misinterpreted. Because
no, you're right
I'm very afraid of this election.
No, you're right to be worried. Was that original quote from me?
Yes.
Yeah, because see, in the traditional notion of our political system, and it worked a lot of our history. Um, to put it simplistically, you try to get things done before the election, so you could go home, or if you were running for president, you could go on the stump and say, "This is what I helped to make happen. This is good for you, my voters. So that's why you should reelect me, or vice versa." And somehow we got into a situation with the partisanship where today people tend to campaign against the other side. And the whole idea is, I wanted to do this for you, but those bums in the other party stopped me. And I agree with you. This has the potential to be a really vicious election. I will tell you that, you've mentioned no labels a couple of times, Frank, and I appreciate it. For those who don't know, it's an organization about 10 years old. I've been privileged to be the chair for about 5 years now. Basically, we've tried different ways to encourage members of Congress of both parties to be problem solvers, to come to the middle and negotiate, compromise, get something done. And it started out just trying to bring people together around ideas and convince them that here's an idea that we polled it, and this is supported by a majority of Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, so you ought to be for it. Well, that helped a little bit, but then we decided, the part of the problem here is financial, money, and political. And a lot of people in Congress are worried that if they break from their party or they go against a powerful interest group in the party, they're going to get challenged in a primary and they're going to lose re-election. And we started to raise money to support people that we consider to be problem solvers or potential problem solvers, basically center-right Republicans, center-left Democrats. Most exciting thing that happened is you were kind enough to point out, is it led to a group called the House Problem Solvers Caucus. Now 50 members, 25 Republicans, 25 Democrats. And honestly, they worked together and they produced and pressured the leadership of both parties to produce legislation. The Senate, we're working on in this session and this election to try to have a similar group. And we got an interesting group of people there. Joe Manchin, Susan Collins have always been there, but now Bill Cassidy from Louisiana, Republican, Jackie Rosen from, I guess, Nevada, a Democrat. Am I right? Yeah. Working together to build that. So, and this is all about being able to say to people exactly what you've said. I went to Washington and I worked with people in the other party to get this done for you, my constituents, for our community, and for our country. And final word, just anytime, one of the most fascinating questions that I've seen on polls, you ask voters, do you want the people you elect to Congress to, when they get there, to stick absolutely to everything they promised you they believed in when you voted for them, or do you want them to compromise in order to get something done? And the second choice, compromise to get something done, always gets 60-70% of the votes. So here's what I'm saying, and this is probably naive and it won't happen, but there may be a path to victory this year for a candidate who will not be engaged in the attack, counterattack, and just say, here's what I'm going to do. And yeah, I'm going to work with members of the other party because that's the way you get something done in our country. And now, of all times, we can't afford to be partisan because thousands of our people are sick and dying. And our economy is in the tank, and we got to work together to get it out. That's it.
And you have final question, and it's a simple quote, simple sentence. I believe that our national security lies not just in protecting our borders, but in bridging divides. I'm asking you not as a politician, but I used to come visit you because you were wise, and we would not talk about politics. We would talk about life. And I have students on this call. I've got faculty on this call. I've got parents on this call. I've got members of Congress on this call. This is not between Republicans and Democrats. I don't want you to answer it between senators and congressmen. As human beings, I've been trying so hard since I got sick to bridge that gap, to find that middle ground, to say to people, if I can change my mind after 58 years, why can't you change yours? You've always been a consensus builder. You've always been kind and generous and respectful. How do I tell those mean people out there, students and their parents and their grandparents, that we are not perfect, that we don't have all the answers, and that we should learn to respect each other and treat each other decently? So please answer this as Joe Lieberman, not the senator or the committee chair or the vice presidential nominee.
Listen, maybe it's because the Sabbath is coming, but I'm going to begin with a religious answer, and as you well know, this is still a very religious country. We are all children of the same God, and every religion that I know of that believes in one God, which is most of the great religions, not only accepts that fact, but understands that from that you have to respect everybody else. You have to look at everybody as a brother, a sister, a child of the same God. And, in the Talmud, it actually says that we're obliged to greet people with a smile and treat them in a friendly way. And even if you're having a disagreement, don't let it get personal. That's the way you grow. So I tell you, if you're looking, there is some encouragement in this terrible crisis. Here in New York, where we are, because 2 of our children and 5 grandchildren are in this neighborhood, 7 o'clock, it happens at a lot of places every night. People come out or open their windows, they start to cheer, and it's growing bigger every day. People are sounding horns, they're sending off firecrackers. And, part of it is not just to say thank you to the healthcare workers and first responders. Part of it is to reach out and somehow touch with this noise everybody else in the community, because there's an understanding we're in this all together, and the sacrifice and the service of the people who are taking care of those who are ill really should affect us all. I think it is. So sometimes, from the old expression, never waste a crisis. This has been an awful crisis, a terrible loss of life. But I hope in the end it shows us that we're all in this together, and it's our humanity on the line, and that goes for life. It's more true of life generally than it is of politics and the media. Politics and the media tend to divide people. And the only way that's going to stop is if the public, the voters, start to vote for people who are uniters and problem solvers and are not demagogues and dividers. And I hope that begins to happen this year.
Well, Senator, we took almost an hour.
Yes.
114 people out of 119 stayed on this call.
Wonderful.
That ought to tell you that they care about what you have to say and appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
And on a personal basis, my mom respected you so much, and you met her,
Oh, I love
and she would tell me that you were the role model that I should be, even how you're dressed, how you behave, how you treat people. And I wish that she were still around so I could say thank you to her, because you're the right guy. And I bless you for being a part of my life, for being a part of America. You are the definition of a statesman, and we are grateful for your time.
Thanks, Frank. Look, if your mom were around, I'd tell her she has a lot to be proud of. You have really, you've been an extremely constructive force in our society, and with God's help, you will for many, many more years to come. Anyway, great to be with you. Take care.
Thank you, Senator,
Be well.
and everyone. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.